Andrei Kurgin was riding his bicycle in central Moscow when he was arrested earlier this summer. His crime, taking part in demonstrations against the barring of opposition candidates from local elections. He had a yellow vest on that day, something police had advised journalists to wear.
When the policeman asked me to see my press card and realized I wasn't a journalist, they threw me to the ground and started beating me up. Here they're trying to take my bike, but I held on to it because I knew that if I didn't, I'd never see it again.
That day, just like the previous week, riot police were ordered to beat up peaceful demonstrators. The brutal police tactics continued. Over 2 weekends of protest, more than 2,300 people were arrested in this way. Most were released a few hours later. Others were in more serious trouble.
It was 2:20 in the morning when the doorbell rang. I looked through the hole and saw a crowd. I thought it was some trouble at the neighbour's place. Then they asked if Sergei was here. We said no, he doesn't live here. Then they started reading a search warrant. We're going to search you.
Tatiana and Vladimir's son Sergei was campaigning for one of the opposition candidates. When he found out the police were looking for him, he turned himself in.
He said goodbye and that's it.
Yes, that's all. And since then, he's been in jail. Even in our worst nightmares, we couldn't have imagined things like this happening in our country. Our son is a law-abiding citizen.
He took part in a peaceful demonstration.
Yes, and he was chanting, "For fair elections," because he's an emotional person. I'm also emotional, so what? Should I go to prison for that?
Sergei is one of 15 people currently on trial for what the Russian justice system calls mass disorders.
Какое-то безумие происходит, я не знаю. Это какой-то кошмар, фарс, цирк.
In the courtroom today, families and loved ones are helpless spectators as the demonstrators risk up to 8 years in a penal colony.
Об избрании меры пресечения в виде заключения под стражу в отношении обвиняемого Костенко Валерия Игоревича оставить без изменения.
Valery Konstantinov is 20, a student. Among his supporters, Nikolai Kavkazsky has already been through this. He went to jail for more than a year for protesting against Vladimir Putin's re-election in 2012.
Back then, the regime was tightening the screws. That was the first time they made large-scale use of this so-called mass disorders offense against the opposition. Today it's the same story repeating itself, but it'll be worse this time. I had a sense of absolute injustice when I was thrown in jail for expressing my views as a citizen. But I also understood that we're living under a dictatorial regime, under heavy authoritarianism, and that they will use the language of force even in response to legal and peaceful demonstrations.
The protesters are not the only ones being jailed. Refused permission to stand in the elections, the now former local election candidates are being found guilty of so-called administrative offences. Opposition politician Dmitry Gudkov gets 10 more days behind bars, on top of the 26 he's already served. For calling on people to protest.
They're afraid of these elections, and they're afraid of strong opposition candidates. The authorities have no support, and that's why they're doing all they can to block us. They lock us up just to prevent us from influencing public opinion in any way.
In the streets of Moscow, calls for free elections have given way to calls for freeing political prisoners. But the repression has clipped the wings of the protest movement, whose participants now know all too well what they're risking.